What is up, guys? It is Jason back again with another video. Today is going to be the first episode of Project Boost, and the first part of this project is going to be getting my car ready to be boosted. So the engine is going to get pulled out. My car is sitting right back here in the garage. I just have it pulled in, haven't even gotten anything done. But today, my goal is to get the whole front assembly of the car off here. So this whole part, the headlight assembly, the crossbar, the cooling system, and the front bumper, the radiator, pretty much all the stuff. And with that off, that'll give us a straight shot at the engine, and basically, like, that's the best way to pull it out. My plan is to pull out the engine and the transmission in one piece, which is pretty easy on this car, because like I said, this entire front part of the car comes off, which just gives you a straight shot at the engine. If you just put your lift right on there, and you can lift the engine up and just pull it straight back with the transmission attached, which is really nice because that's super convenient and easy. So let's get started with removing all of this stuff. And now that the front wheels are off the ground, we can just air out my air suspension, because it's kind of bad to leave the bags inflated. So straight down to 0 psi, and now we can start working. I'm trying to keep all the parts separated into plastic bags. Hopefully that'll make it a little easier when I put the engine back together. So to start, I already took off the fender covers here, and next up I'm gonna get the whole front end to drop off. And to do this, I need to take off the headlights, and there's a few bolts under, and hopefully this whole radiator support piece with the bumper should come off in one piece. So I'm gonna go ahead and take off the headlights, and then we'll see what it looks like from there. Alright guys, everything's going good. So far I have those two headlights off, right here and right here. They're both sitting over there. Tons of parts gonna be laying everywhere. So now pretty much all I need to do is drop these bolts. I already took those top ones off, the bolts over there, and essentially this whole front bumper part with the radiator support bar should come off in one piece. And you're probably asking, where am I going to put that? And that's a good question. We'll figure that out once we get there. So let's see how taking this thing off goes. So instead of dealing with unhooking the cable up there, I'm probably just gonna unscrew the little things there and just take them off the bumper separately. That seems easier, and then we can just hang them off to the side, and once that's clear, we should be able to take this whole thing off. So you can see we now have that entire front bumper with the bash bar. That's all taken off. You can see stuff like the fog lights down there where the bumper mounted to the frame. And now we kind of have a semi-exposed front end. Those are the brake ducts where this whole assembly bolted up right there. We have our radiator, our coolers and stuff. So the next step is going to be to take that stuff off, and then we will see what goes into that. But once we have all the cooling system stuff off, we pretty much have a straight shot at the engine, and that's going to make our life so much easier, because now we don't need to lift the engine up out of the engine bay. We can just literally just pick it up and pull it straight out, which is going to save us in the long run. It might need a little more work now, but I think it's going to save us in the long run. So let's get to the next part. So guys, I'd say the install process is going pretty well so far. So I just got rid of the whole bumper. It's not there anymore. I basically just took that, put it outside here, right under there, just under a tarp, because of course the one weekend you decide to do anything in San Diego, it starts to rain. But yeah, so that's outside, so we have some decent space, and now we can just get started doing the cooling system stuff.
So the first real step was to drain the coolant out of the radiator. You just unscrew that little blue plug and it'll slowly start to drip out of there. Once that was all out, I had to drain the coolant from the block. You just loosen that little screw and it all will drain out and go everywhere on your floor. So next up, I popped off the clips holding the radiator fan on, and that just unplugs and slides right out. Pretty easy. Then came the upper cooling hose, which also just clips loose and comes right out. Then I disconnected the lower coolant hose that goes to the expansion tank. This is going to require some wiggling around, but eventually the expansion tank came out in one piece. Next up, I loosened the screws to the radiator support, and that entire radiator just pulled out in one big piece. So that also spilled on the ground, and I set that aside. Next up came the power steering cooler radiator, and that also just got pushed to the side. You can see me supporting the rotor down there with the jack, and I'm loosening the strut mount nuts up there so I can get the strut bar off the car, which is kind of in the way of everything. So getting to that third strut tower nut can be a little annoying, so I had to grab a box wrench because that's the only thing that could really fit in there. But once that little nut came out, it allowed me to lift the strut brace off of that side, and then I just put the nuts back on that side, just so when I lowered the jack that the whole front suspension on that side wouldn't drop out of the car. After doing the same exact thing on the other side, you can see the strut brace came off in one piece. After removing that strut brace, I started to go ahead and cut off the zip ties that were holding up the positive battery cable, some of my air lines, and other miscellaneous wires. Once those were all gone, that allowed me to pull off the entire cabin air filter housing assembly. I took that off and I set that aside. So at this point I kind of took a breather just to take a second to look around, so you can kind of see what's going on in the garage. So you can see all the stuff that's been taken off, the ECU cover, cabin air filter, strut brace, pretty much the entire front end, all the cooling stuff. There's a bucket of the parts I've taken off so far. Next up, I removed the fuel rail cover. First popped off those little screw covers, then removed both of those 10mm nuts. And once those were gone, the cover just pulled straight off and I set it aside. I got started removing the positive terminal point here. I removed that cable, just put the nut back, and then pulled the cable out of the way. At this point in time, I started to remove the mounting screws for the PCV return manifold system. I cranked them loose by hand, then I started to loosen them with the impact. Next up, I just pried loose the manifold, and then I struggled to get the vacuum lines to let go, and eventually it popped out. Then I disconnected the little electrical plug and pulled the manifold away. At this point, I removed the crankcase breather hose, and I routed it back through the little gap that it was wedged through. Once that was out, I also removed my oil catch can's return line, which leads back to the intake manifold. I started to remove my little ghetto air intake boot bracket there, and once that was out of the way, it allowed me to remove my catch can system. I pulled it out of the way and I set it aside. It's really hard to see in this shot, but at this point I started to remove the F-boot off the intake. I basically just sprayed a ton of silicone lubricant on it, and I found that prying it out with a screwdriver worked the best. You gotta be really careful here, otherwise you're gonna tear the intake boot. Next up, I started to loosen the clamp that was holding the intake boot on. I loosened it with a screwdriver, and then I pried it loose, and it should come off pretty easily. I removed that part and I set it aside. Now that the intake boot was out of the way, I started to remove the torque screws that were holding the DISA onto the intake manifold. There's two of them, the one hides below, and then the DISA should just pop right out. And here you can kind of see how the actuator flap actually kind of works. You really can't see much of anything in this shot, but yet again I removed the clamps holding the lower intake boot on, then I used my pry bar to wiggle it loose. It was a little difficult to get it to come loose, but once it comes loose it should just pop right off. Then I removed the oil dipstick tube bolt, which you can see down there, and once that's free you can essentially just wiggle the oil dipstick tube out. It has a little O-ring on it, so it can be a little tight going into the oil pan, so really you just gotta wiggle it around, pull it out, play with it, and eventually it should just slide out. Now that the dipstick tube was out of the way, I started to address some of the various electrical connections leading to the engine block. So there are a few up front, a bunch of various ones that I just disconnected, and then once they were loose I routed them back around through the little gaps they were coming through and pulled them free. Next up, I took off the mounting bolts for the power steering fluid reservoir. I loosened that, took those bolts off, and once that was off I just pushed it to the side. So bolted onto the intake manifold is this little hub where all those little sensor wires, ignition wires, and so on, all of them route to that, and from that hub goes a big loom, which you can see at the right side of the screen, and that goes up to the actual ECU. So this thing is bolted on with just one bolt onto the intake manifold. So once I took that off, I just made sure that none of the other little wires attached to it were still hooked up to anything, and once I made sure they were all clear, I just pulled that whole unit and pushed it off to the side. Next up, I removed the idle control valve, which is located right above the throttle body. It's held on by two T30 Torx screws, and once those are loose, it can be a little stuck, so you see me use the pry bar. I just convinced it to come loose. You don't need much force, and you just use the pry bar to wiggle it loose, and once it's loose, it'll pull right out. Now that we have the ICV out of the way, it gives you access to the 4 6mm bolts holding the actual throttle body onto the intake manifold. So some of these are a little hard to get to. There's 2 of them right at the top. It's pretty much just getting your hands in there, wiggling around, figuring out. But once those bolts are off, the throttle body should just pull right off the intake manifold. Next up, I started to address the fuel injection part of the intake manifold. So here you can see me unclipping the little clips that clip the injector harness onto the actual injectors, and once those clips are all gone, you can see that that whole harness pack just pulls right off. These clips can get lost very easily. I found myself having to use my magnetic extension tool to pick up a few of them that fell out. So when you take these off, I would recommend that you take the physical clip and clip it back onto the plug on that little harness pack, just so you don't lose it. And once you put the whole thing back together, it'll make it so much easier and you won't have to be looking for those clips. Next up, I addressed the other sets of clips on the injectors here, and these clips clip the actual injectors onto the fuel rail, so these pry off really easy. You can just see me using a screwdriver. And once all those clips are loose, you should be able to just pry or pull up on the fuel rail and it should come off. Before you do that, make sure that there's no fuel pressure in your fuel rail. You can see that there's a little Schrader valve. You can use that to let out the pressure. I had the car running and I let it run dead, so there was no fuel pressure in here for me. And even then, a crap ton of gas still came out, and you can see me freaking out with the rags trying to cover it up. So be careful with this and make sure that you are in a well-ventilated area. After removing that fuel rail, I just pried out the 3 remaining injectors that were stuck inside the intake manifold. The next step was to remove the intake manifold bolts that hold it onto the actual block. They were a little too tight for the impact gun, so I broke them loose first with the ratchet, and then I just spun them off with the impact. After that, the intake manifold was pretty much free to just pull off. I discovered that there was a ton of wiring connections and vacuum hoses under the intake manifold, so once I lifted it up, I started to disconnect all of those, and the whole thing pulled out of the way. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching the first episode of Project Boost. Stay tuned for the next episodes. They're coming out really soon. It's just this editing takes so long, but those episodes are coming. So if you like this video, leave a like below, leave a comment, tell me what I did wrong, make a suggestion, whatever I can do to make the videos better for you guys, just let me know. I love to hear what you guys have to say. And if you're a new viewer, go ahead, click the subscribe button, and look out for more videos coming very soon. Alright guys, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.